Get out, and don't you ever dare look back at this house again. As of this moment, you no longer exist to us." Those were the last words my father, Arthur Miller, ever said to me. It was March 15th, 2023, exactly 6:14 p.m. I remember the precise time because the grandfather clock in our marble foyer struck the quarter hour just as he threw a black, heavy-duty trash bag at my feet. Inside that bag was my entire life, or at least the parts of it he deemed worthy of me keeping. My mother, Evelyn, didn't even stand up. She sat in her favorite velvet armchair, the one that cost more than most people's cars, calmly sipping her Earl Grey tea. The rhythmic clink of her silver spoon against the fine porcelain was the only other sound in the room. It was a chilling domestic sound that felt more violent than a scream. I stood there, 26 years old, feeling like a total stranger in the house where I'd taken my first steps. "All this for what, Dad?" I asked, my voice trembling but not breaking. "Because I'm marrying a man who actually cares about people? Because he's a teacher and not some hedge fund shark you can brag about at the country club?" My father stepped closer, the smell of expensive cigars and cold arrogance radiating off him. "You're marrying a $52,000 a year failure, Maya. You're choosing a life of chalk dust and cramped apartments over the Miller legacy. If you walk out that door with Julian Reed, you are dead to this family. I will strip you of your name, your trust fund, and every connection I've spent 30 years building for you. By tomorrow morning, the world will forget you ever carried the name Miller." I looked at my mother, desperate for a flicker of the woman who used to tuck me in every night. But she just blew on her tea, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from the cup. I had already become invisible to her. I picked up the trash bag. I didn't cry. Not then. I reached into my pocket and handed him my keys, the keys to the mansion, the keys to the $90,000 Mercedes he'd bought me for graduation, and the gold-plated family crest keychain. "Keep the money, Dad," I said, my voice finally steady. "You'll need it to buy the loyalty I used to give you for free." I walked out into the pouring Connecticut rain. Julian was waiting in his 2012 Honda Civic at the end of the long driveway. As I threw my bag into his trunk, I looked back at the mansion. Every light was on, but the house had never looked more hollow. They thought they were taking away my future. They had no idea I was about to build one they couldn't even imagine. Before I tell you what happened over the next 3 years and how those same people ended up begging at my doorstep, I need to ask you something. Have you ever been forced to choose between the people who gave you life and the person who makes life worth living? If this story is hitting you in a place that feels familiar, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us keep sharing these stories of resilience and justice. Also, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I read every single one of them. Now, let me take you back to how it all started, long before the trash bags and the ultimatums, to the moment my perfect family realized I wasn't going to play their game anymore. To understand why my father was willing to erase me from existence, you have to understand the world I came from. The Millers didn't just have money. We had the kind of influence that made the air in the room feel heavy the moment we walked in. Our estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, was a $15.4 million monument to my father's ego. It had 12 bathrooms, a private theater, and a lawn so manicured it didn't look like it was meant to be walked on. In that house, everything was about the image. My sister Chloe was the golden child. She was 2 years older and had never once missed a step. She cruised through Yale Law, landed a position at a top-tier firm in Manhattan, and was currently dating a man whose last name was on the side of a skyscraper. Every Sunday at 6 p.m. sharp, we sat for dinner. It was a ritual, not a meal. My father sat at the head, Chloe to his right, the seat of honor, and me at the very end, closest to the kitchen. "Chloe, tell us about the merger you're handling," my father would say, leaning back and looking at her with a pride I had never seen directed at me. I was the wild card. I didn't want to be a corporate lawyer or an investment banker. I wanted to do something that felt real. I had a degree in sociology, but in the Miller household, if you weren't accumulating wealth, you were accumulating failure. And Maya, my mother would add, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness while she adjusted her $12,000 diamond tennis bracelet. Did you find a job yet that doesn't involve, what was it? Charity. I'm working at a nonprofit for inner city youth, Mom, I'd tell her, trying to keep my voice steady. My father would just scoff and go back to his vintage Cabernet. Waste of time. You're playing at being poor, Maya. It's embarrassing to the family. People at the club ask what you're doing, and I have to make things up just to save face. Then, in August 2022, I met Julian. It was at a community outreach event in downtown New Haven. I was organizing a book drive, and he walked in carrying 4 heavy boxes of historical biographies. He was 30, with kind eyes and a laugh that didn't sound like it was rehearsed for a gala. I'm Julian, he said, setting the boxes down and wiping sweat from his forehead. I teach history at the local high school. I heard you needed more nonfiction for the seniors. We spent 3 hours talking that day. Not about mergers, stock prices, or 401k matches, but about the impact of education and how one person showing up can change a kid's entire life. For the first time in my life, I felt seen. Not as a Miller, not as a disappointment, but as a person. Over the next 6 months, Julian became my sanctuary. He lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment that smelled like old books and fresh coffee. His life was simple, but it was full. He made $52,000 a year, and he spent his weekends coaching the JV basketball team for free. I didn't tell my parents about him for a long time. I knew what they would see, a dead-end job and a low-class life. But I was happy. I was genuinely happy for the first time in 26 years. I thought, maybe, just maybe, if they saw how much he loved me, they would understand. I thought they would value my joy over their status. That was my first big mistake. I was measuring their hearts with a ruler they didn't even possess. By December, I knew I wanted to marry him. Julian didn't have a trust fund or a yacht, but he had integrity. He showed up when he said he would. He remembered my favorite flower, yellow tulips, and he listened to me talk for hours without once checking his watch. He was everything my father wasn't. And that is exactly why my father hated him before he even met him. The night I brought Julian home for dinner was meant to be an introduction. Instead, it became an interrogation. My father had already done his research. I should have known. He didn't just meet people. He vetted them like potential acquisitions. The atmosphere in the dining room was suffocating. My mother was wearing her most expensive silk gown, and my father was in a tailored suit, looking like he was ready to sign a billion-dollar treaty. Julian wore his best charcoal sweater and corduroy pants. He looked handsome and sincere, but to my parents, he looked like a target. So, Julian, my father began, not even looking up from his medium-rare steak. Maya tells me you're a history teacher at a public school? Yes, sir, Julian said, his voice calm and polite. I've been at Hill House High for 5 years now. 5 years, my father repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. And what is the ceiling for a career like that? 60? 70,000? It's not about the ceiling for me, Mr. Miller. It's about the students, helping them understand their potential. Help them understand how to be as mediocre as you, my father interrupted, his eyes finally snapping up to meet Julian's. The room went cold. I dropped my fork, the metal clattering against the fine china with a sharp ping. Dad, that's enough. My mother finally spoke, her eyes fixed on her teacup, never once looking at Julian. We've worked very hard to provide Maya with a certain level of comfort, Julian. A teacher's salary wouldn't even cover the property taxes on our summer home. You have to understand our concern for her future. I understand that you value money, Julian replied, and I felt a surge of pride at the steadiness of his voice. But I value Maya, and I can provide her with a life where she is respected, supported, and loved. That's something money can't buy. My father let out a harsh, barking laugh. Respected? You think people respect a man who brings home a paycheck that barely covers his rent? "You're a bottom feeder, Julian. You're a man with no ambition, trying to drag my daughter down into the mud with you because you can't climb out of it yourself." The insults didn't stop. For 40 minutes, they tore him apart. They called him low stock, a charity case, and damaged goods. My mother sat there, the same cold expression on her face, occasionally adding a jab about how difficult life would be when we couldn't afford the basics, which to her meant private jets and designer clothes. Then came the ultimatum. My father stood up, his face flushed with anger, his hand slamming onto the mahogany table. "Maya, you have exactly 10 seconds to tell this man to leave and never contact you again. If you choose him, you are choosing poverty. You are choosing to be a nobody. I will not have the Miller legacy tarnished by a public school teacher. You marry him, and you are dead to this family. No money, no name, no connections. Nothing." I looked at Julian. He was hurt. I could see the flash of pain in his eyes, but he didn't look down. He looked at me, waiting. Then I looked at my parents. They weren't fighting for my future. They were fighting for their pride. They didn't care about my happiness. They cared about the Miller brand. "I'm choosing him," I said. My voice was quiet, but it filled the room like a thunderclap. My mother didn't even blink. She just took another slow sip of her tea. My father pointed his finger toward the door, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Then get out. Take your things and don't you ever look back. You aren't a Miller anymore. You're just another struggling girl married to a struggling man. I hope his history lessons teach you how to survive when you have nothing." We walked out that night. No hugs, no tears from my mother, just the sound of the heavy oak door clicking shut behind us. My father called my sister, Chloe, and my brother, Marcus, immediately. He told them I was a disgrace. He told them they were forbidden from speaking to me, or they'd face the same fate. And they listened. They always listened to the man with the checkbook. The morning after I walked out, the reality of my father's erasure began to set in with clinical, cold efficiency. I woke up on the couch in Julian's small apartment, the smell of his old books and cheap coffee usually a comfort. But today, there was a heavy weight in my chest. I reached for my phone to check my banking app, a habit born of years of luxury. My thumb hovered over the screen, and for the first time in my life, the login failed. "Access denied," the screen read. "Please contact your branch manager." I tried my credit cards next. The Black Centurion card, the Gold Business Line, the Emergency Platinum. Every single one came back with the same message: declined. My father hadn't just cut me off. He had used his connections as a board member of the bank to freeze my personal savings, money my grandmother had left specifically for me. Legally, it was a gray area he could navigate with his army of lawyers for months. To me, it was a death sentence to my old life. By 10:00 a.m., my email was flooded. Notifications from the Miller Family Trust informed me that my health insurance had been terminated. The lease on my downtown studio, the one my father paid for as a graduation gift, was being canceled effective immediately. Even my phone plan was gone. I was sitting in a $1,200 a apartment in Queens, holding a piece of glass that was now nothing more than a paperweight. "He really did it," I whispered, staring at the blank screen. Julian came over and knelt beside me, placing a hand on my knee. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He knew who my father was. "We have my salary, Maya, and we have $4,200 in my savings. It's not a mansion, but it's enough to start. We'll find a way." I looked at him and felt a surge of both love and guilt. He was a history teacher, a man who gave everything to his students, and now he was shouldering the burden of a disowned heiress. But that guilt turned into a cold, hard resolve. My father thought I was nothing without his name. He thought the Miller money was the only thing that made me valuable. I was going to prove him wrong, even if it took every ounce of strength I had. The silence from the rest of my family was the loudest part. I tried calling my sister, Chloe, straight to voicemail. I tried my brother, Marcus. The call was disconnected. I later found out through a mutual friend that my father had held a family meeting that morning. He told them that anyone who contacted me would be cut out of the will immediately. He didn't just take away my money, he built a wall around my siblings and my mother, a wall made of gold and fear. I spent that first week selling everything I had managed to take in that trash bag. My designer handbags, my jewelry, even my high-end camera. I walked into a pawn shop in Brooklyn with a Chanel bag that cost $6,500 and walked out with $200 in cash. It was a humbling, jarring experience. Every time the clerk looked at me with pity, I thought of my mother sipping her tea while I was cast out. Every time I counted the crumpled $20 bills, I felt my father's shadow looming over me. But as I walked back to Julian's apartment that evening, the rain soaking through my thin jacket, I realized something. For the first time in 26 years, no one was telling me who to be. No one was measuring my worth against a stock portfolio. I was Maya. No last name, no trust fund, just Maya. And for that version of me, the possibilities were endless. The first year was a blur of caffeine, blue light from a laptop screen, and the kind of exhaustion that lives in your bones. While Julian spent his days in the classroom, I spent mine in a corner of our 600-square-foot apartment, building the foundation of what would become Project Scholar. I had seen the toll that administrative work took on Julian. He spent 4 hours every night grading papers, filling out state-mandated forms, and trying to track the progress of 150 different students. "I just want to teach, Maya," he told me one night, his head resting on the table. "But the system is designed to bury us in paperwork." That was the spark. I used the last of my pawned item money, exactly $2,150, to register my own LLC, Sterling Tech Solutions. Sterling was my middle name, a name my father rarely used, and it felt like a quiet act of rebellion to use it as my brand. I taught myself to code through free online boot camps and stayed up until 3 a.m. every night building a prototype for a specialized edtech platform. It wasn't just a management tool, it was an AI-driven assistant designed specifically for public school teachers in the United States. By the end of year 1, the statistics were modest but real. I had my first 100 users, mostly Julian's colleagues who were desperate for help. Our total revenue for the first 12 months was exactly $45,200. After expenses, I had cleared about $12,000. It was less than I used to spend on a single shopping trip on Fifth Avenue, but every cent of it felt like a victory. I remember the day we hit $10,000 in the bank. Julian and I celebrated by ordering a large pizza instead of the usual frozen ramen. It was the best meal of my life. I didn't just build software, I built a culture. I hired my first 3 employees in year 2. They were all former teachers or people who had been cast out of corporate tech because they didn't fit the mold. We worked out of a co-working space in Long Island City that smelled like burnt toast and ambition. I was the CEO, the lead developer, and the janitor. I showed up at 6 a.m. with sawdust from the construction next door in my hair and left at midnight. Year 2 was the breakthrough. Word of mouth spread. Suddenly, a school district in New Jersey contacted us, then a private academy in Massachusetts. I refined the algorithm, focusing on service over status, the very thing my father had mocked. By the middle of year 2, our active user base jumped from 1,000 to 50,000. I'll never forget the day I sat in a windowless conference room in Boston, pitching to my first group of venture capitalists. They looked at my modest suit and my scuffed heels, and then they looked at my data. "You have a 98% retention rate among teachers," one of them said, leaning forward. "That's unheard of in this sector. Why do they stay?" "Because I built this for people, not for profit," I told him, my voice steady. But as you can see from the revenue projections, the profit follows the people. That afternoon, I signed a term sheet for my first $1.2 million in seed funding. I sat in my car, a beat-up 2015 Toyota I'd bought with my own earnings, and I cried. Not because of the money, but because I had done it without a single phone call from a miller. I had built a legacy out of the nothing my father said I was. By the end of year 2, Sterling Tech had moved into a real office. We had 45 employees, Our revenue was projected to hit $3.5 million. I was featured in a 30 under 30 tech list, but I used a professional pseudonym for the interview, M.E. Sterling. I wasn't ready for the Millers to find me yet. I wanted my empire to be so large that by the time they noticed, they couldn't even reach the top of the walls. Meanwhile, Julian continued to teach. He was my rock, my chairman of the board in spirit, and my constant reminder of why I was doing this. My parents thought he was a dead end, but he was the fuel that kept the fire burning. They thought they had taken away my future, but they had actually given me the one thing money couldn't buy: a purpose. Every Sunday, I thought about the dinner at the mansion. I imagined them sitting there, Chloe talking about her legal mergers, my father complaining about the economy, and my mother silently sipping her tea. They had no idea that the useless daughter was now the CEO of the fastest-growing edtech company in the Northeast. They had no idea that the world hadn't forgotten the name Miller. It just didn't need it anymore. I had a new name now, one I had earned with my own sweat and late-night tears, and I was just getting started. We're at a point in the story where the tables are starting to turn, but the biggest shock is still to come. You won't believe who my father's biggest business rival just partnered with, and how a single middle name was about to bring the mighty Arthur Miller to his knees. Before I reveal the moment they realized exactly who they had thrown away, I want to hear from you. If you were in my shoes, would you save the people who disowned you, or would you let them face the consequences of their own pride? Drop a yes or no in the comments. I'm genuinely curious to see what you think. And if you're enjoying how this justice is unfolding, make sure to give this video a thumbs up. It helps us get these stories out to more people who need to hear that their worth isn't defined by anyone else's opinion. Now, let's get into the collapse of the Miller Empire. While I was building Sterling Tech in the trenches of Queens and eventually the high-rises of Manhattan, the Miller family legacy was quietly rotting from the inside. For 30 years, my father, Arthur Miller, had operated on a simple philosophy: too big to fail. He believed that his connections, his name, and his sheer volume of capital made him invincible. But the world was changing, and Arthur Miller was stuck in 1995. It started in the fall of 2025. Miller Global Investments had bet heavily on a series of outdated infrastructure bonds for school districts across the tri-state area. It was supposed to be a safe, multi-billion-dollar play. But a new federal regulation, the Educational Transparency Act, had just been passed. Every district was now required to provide real-time, granular data on student performance and administrative spending to maintain their funding. If the districts lost their funding, the bonds would default. And if the bonds defaulted, Miller Global would face a liquidity crisis that could wipe out 40% of their portfolio in a single quarter. My father's firm was in a blind panic. They had the money, but they didn't have the technology. Their internal systems were a chaotic mess of spreadsheets and legacy software that couldn't handle the new federal reporting requirements. They were hemorrhaging money, $2.4 million a week in compliance fines alone. I was sitting in my corner office on the 42nd floor of the Sterling Tech building, overlooking the Chrysler building, when my COO, Sarah, walked in. She threw a thick folder onto my mahogany desk. "You're not going to believe who just sent us an urgent request for proposal," she said, a smirk playing on her lips. I opened the folder. The logo at the top made my blood run cold and then boil with a strange, dark irony. Miller Global Investments. "They're desperate, Maya," Sarah continued, unaware of the history behind the name. "They've tried 3 other firms, and nobody's API can integrate with the school district systems as fast as ours. We are literally the only company in the United States with the infrastructure to save their bonds from defaulting. They're offering a $4.8 million implementation fee and a $1.2 million annual licensing contract. It's the biggest lead we've had all year." I leaned back in my chair, my fingers tracing the silver nameplate on my desk, Maya S. Reed, CEO. The S stood for Sterling, my middle name. the name my father had used to identify me on legal documents but never spoke with affection. He had spent my childhood telling me I was a bad investment. Now he was begging a company named after my middle name to save his life's work. I pulled up the latest financial reports for Miller Global. They were worse than the public knew. Their stock had dropped from $112 to $68 in just 6 months. My sister Chloe's law firm was already distancing itself from the fallout. My mother's socialite budget was being scrutinized by auditors. The mansion in Greenwich, the place where my father told me I was dead, was reportedly being appraised for a potential sale to cover short-term debt. The irony was delicious, but the professional in me remained cold. I didn't want a win based on spite. I wanted a win based on the fact that I was better at the game than he was. "Schedule a meeting," I said, my voice calm. "But don't tell them who the CEO is. Tell them the executive team will meet with their representatives on Friday at 10 a.m. at our headquarters." They asked if they could send the senior partner, Arthur Miller himself, Sarah added. "Apparently, he wants to personally vet the stability of the firm before they sign the contract. He's still a bit of a control freak." "Let him come," I replied. That night, I went home to our new house in Westchester. Julian was in the kitchen, grading papers for his honors history class. He looked up and smiled, and for a moment, the $12 million revenue and the corporate warfare vanished. "You look like you're plotting a revolution," he joked, kissing my forehead. "Not a revolution, Julian," I said, leaning against the counter. "Just a lesson. My father is coming to the office on Friday. He needs Sterling Tech to survive. He has no idea that the useless teacher's wife he kicked out into the rain is the person holding his entire world in her hands." Julian paused, his pen hovering over a student's essay. "Are you going to help him?" "I'm going to do business with him," I said, "but he's going to learn that in this world, worth isn't something you inherit. It's something you build." Friday, October 24th, 2025, exactly 10 a.m. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office on the 42nd floor, watching the yellow cabs crawl like ants through the streets of Manhattan. Below me was a city I had conquered with nothing but a laptop and a heart full of resolve. Behind me, the office hummed with the quiet energy of 180 employees. These people didn't work for a Miller, they worked for a mission. My assistant Sarah buzzed through the intercom. "Ms. Sterling, the representatives from Miller Global Investments are here. Mr. Arthur Miller and Mrs. Evelyn Miller are in the lobby." "Send them in, Sarah," I said. My voice was like ice, calm, clear, and unyielding. I heard the heavy glass doors open. I didn't turn around immediately. I wanted them to feel the space. I wanted them to see the awards on the wall, the ISO certifications, and the framed first dollar we ever earned. I wanted them to realize that this mediocre life they had predicted for me was actually a kingdom. "Ms. Sterling," my father's voice called out. It was different. The booming arrogance was gone. It sounded thin, strained, and desperate. "We're here to discuss the compliance software integration. We're in a bit of a time-sensitive situation." I slowly turned my chair around. The silence that followed was so thick I could hear the rhythmic ticking of my father's $40,000 Patek Philippe watch, a watch that would soon be in a pawn shop if he didn't sign my contract. My mother stood beside him, clutching her Hermes Birkin bag like a life preserver. Her face, usually so composed with Botox and arrogance, was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. "Maya," she whispered. The word barely left her lips. My father's face went through a terrifying transformation, from confusion to recognition, and finally to a pale, ghostly gray. He looked at me, then at the nameplate on my desk, then back at me. "Sterling Tech," he muttered, his voice cracking. "Sterling, your middle name. You own this?" "I built this, Arthur," I said. I didn't call him Dad. I couldn't. That title had died the night of the trash bags. "Sit down. We have a lot to discuss, And according to your RFP, your bonds will default in exactly 72 hours if you don't integrate our systems. They sat, but they looked like they were sitting on needles. My father, the man who had lectured me on The Image for 26 years, couldn't even meet my eyes. My mother kept looking around the room, her eyes landing on a photo on my desk, a photo of me and Julian laughing on a beach in Maine. We had no idea, my mother said, her voice shaking. Maya, we were told you were, well, we thought you were still in that small apartment in Queens. You thought I was failing, I corrected her, because that's what you wanted to believe. You needed me to be a failure so you could feel right about throwing me away. My father leaned forward, his hands trembling on his lap. Maya, please, I'm not here to argue about the past. Miller Global is facing a federal audit. If we don't get the Sterling Reed integration, we lose the school district contracts. We lose the Greenwich estate. Everything I've built for 30 years, it's all on the line. I know the numbers, Arthur, I said, leaning back. I know you're losing $2.4 million a week in compliance fines. I know your stock is at a 5-year low, and I know that I am the only person in the United States who can save you. Then help us, my mother pleaded. Tears were actually welling in her eyes, real tears of fear, not for her daughter, but for her lifestyle. We're family, Maya. Blood is thicker than water. You didn't think blood was very thick when you watched me walk out into the rain with a trash bag, I said, my voice rising for the first time. You didn't think about family when you told my brother and sister I was a disgrace and a bad investment. You didn't think about blood when you called the man I love trash and damaged goods. Just then, the side door to my office opened. Julian walked in. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing his school blazer over a sweater, looking exactly like the teacher my father had mocked. He walked over to me, placed a steadying hand on my shoulder, and looked at my parents. Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Miller, Julian said, his voice full of the dignity they had tried to strip from him. It's been a long 3 years. My father looked at the man he had called a bottom feeder. This bottom feeder was now the chairman of the board of the company that held the Millers' survival in its hands. Julian, my father said, the name tasting like ash, I apologize for everything. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about the value of what you do. You're not apologizing to us, Arthur, Julian said gently but firmly. You're apologizing to the bank. You're apologizing to your shareholders. If you truly cared, you would have called 3 years ago when Maya was working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. My father stood up, and for a moment I thought he was going to walk out, but instead he did something I never thought I'd see. He walked toward my desk and lowered his head. I'm begging you, Maya, he whispered. Don't let the name Miller be erased from the world. Save the company. I'll do anything. I'll step down. I'll issue a public apology to Julian. Just don't destroy us. I looked at the man who had once been my god. He looked small. He looked fragile. He looked like a man who had realized too late that you can't buy the things that truly matter. I pulled a contract out of my drawer. I'm not going to destroy you, Arthur. I'm better than that. But here are my terms. Sterling Tech will save your firm. But the Miller name is coming off the building. The integration will be branded under Sterling Reed. You will pay the full licensing fee, plus a 20% legacy restoration tax that will go directly into a scholarship fund for public school teachers in Connecticut. My father didn't even read the fine print. He grabbed a pen and signed his name with a shaking hand. Is that all? He asked. One more thing, I said. You're going to call Chloe and Marcus. You're going to tell them that Maya and Julian are the most successful investments this family ever made. And then you're going to leave. Because Julian and I have a life to get back to. A life that doesn't involve sipping tea while our children are erased. They walked out of the office, their heads bowed, their shoulders slumped. As the glass doors closed behind them, I turned to Julian. We did it, I whispered. No, Maya, he said, pulling me into a hug. You did it. I just showed up. They say success is the best revenge, but I've learned that peace is even better. My father did step down from the firm 6 months later. My mother still sips her tea in Greenwich, but the mansion feels a lot quieter now that they know their useless child is the only reason they still have a roof over their heads. I didn't go back for Thanksgiving, and I didn't ask for my trust fund back. I didn't need it. Julian is still teaching history, and he's still the most respected man I know. Every year, our scholarship fund sends 50 teachers' kids to college, fully paid for by the Miller tax. My parents taught me that my worth was tied to a name and a bank account. They were wrong. My worth was built in the 2 a.m. coding sessions in the small apartment in Queens, and in the arms of a man who saw a queen where they saw a maid. If you're out there right now and your family has told you that you're trash or damaged goods because you chose love or a simple life, I want you to remember this. The people who try to erase you are usually the ones who are most afraid of your light. Don't fight them. Just build. Build your life. Build your integrity and build your own family. Because one day, they'll be the ones standing at your door, and you'll realize that the only thing useless about you was the time you spent believing them. Thank you for listening to my story. Stay strong and keep building. My name is Maya Sterling Reed, and I am not useless. I never was.